Both the United States and Canada share a colonial history. Indeed, without European colonization of North America, the North American countries we live in today would be radically different, or may not even exist at all. But although colonialism birthed two of today's most influential nations, elsewhere in the world it hindered the creation of others. Indeed, in this lesson we will examine two places where colonialism was foisted upon the local population, hindering the creation of organic and self-governed nation-states, India and Turkey. For centuries prior to World War I, the Ottoman Empire had ruled over vast parts of the Middle East, Northern Africa, and even large swaths of the Balkans in Europe. The expansive empire, however, had been slowly declining over the previous few hundred years, losing much of its territory in the Balkans in separate conflicts with Austria, Russia, and other European powers. Economically, it had been slowly weakened by the colonization of North America and the growth of the Atlantic trade routes, as Western Europe no longer relied solely on trade with the Far East through the Mediterranean and Ottoman-controlled waters. As soon as the flagging Ottoman Empire joined World War I on the German side, the Allies began making plans to break up the Ottoman Empire into colonial plots for each of the victorious Allied powers. Power over the shipping through the Dardanelles was to go to Russia, Smyrna on the Mediterranean coast to Greece, and the Middle East was to be divvied up between France and Great Britain. The Allies carried out this partitioning through the effective imprisonment of the Ottoman Sultan, who was kept under close guard and forced to agree to the splitting up of the empire. In 1918 and 1919, the various Allied nations took control of their Allied possessions, leaving the former Ottoman Empire in control of only Constantinople and parts of northern Anatolia. Not all Turks were willing to take the breakup of the Ottoman Empire lightly. Soon after the empire's partitioning, a nationalist movement cropped up. While these Turkish nationalists were willing to accept the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, they refused to accept the partitioning of the Turkish homeland, and called for all Turkish-speaking peoples to rise up in resistance to foreign powers, taking control of territory in Asia Minor. This movement was fostered and led by a former Ottoman official, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Ataturk had fled the Ottoman capital soon after the Allies' occupation, and by 1919 his forces were fighting a guerrilla war against the Greeks, and they soon set up a Turkish nationalist government in Ankara. Full-scale battle between the Turks and Greeks continued throughout 1920 and 1921, with Ataturk winning several victories, forcing the Greeks out of Inner Anatolia. In 1922, Ataturk's troops continued to push back the Greeks, even to the point of capturing Smyrna, the city the Allies had granted the Greeks in the partitioning of the Ottoman Empire. What remained of the Greek forces were forced to evacuate across the sea back to Greece. At this point, the British intervened and proposed a truce to end the fighting, which confirmed the Turkish nationalist governments in its gains. Additionally, both the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople and the Ankara-based nationalist government were invited to determine a final solution to the conflict. The Treaty of Lausanne in July of 1923 confirmed the borders of a Turkish state that largely is the Turkey we know today, with the exception of a few border disputes with Iraq, which were settled by the League of Nations later in the decade. Furthermore, the nationalist government installed by Ataturk at Ankara was recognized as the only legitimate government of the Republic of Turkey, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was confirmed as Turkey's first president. Whereas Turkey was fighting off attempts at colonization by the victorious powers of World War I, Indians in the interwar period had to contend with colonialism that had been established in prior centuries. Prior to World War I, India had been increasingly ruled by the British Crown, who wrested power over India from the declining British East India Company. The British ruled with paternalist views that insulted the intelligence of Indians and Indian society. The British believed that through their rule they could educate and modernize Indians using anachronistic Western principles until Indians could rule themselves via European-style institutions and government. In reality, England exerted strong and at times violent control over India because of the great economic profit the English made off the colony. India provided a market for British goods, while simultaneously providing cheap goods for the rest of the empire. Intellectual resistance to colonialism began in India with the institution of the Indian National Congress in 1885. In its early years, the Indian National Congress argued against the narrow-minded view of the ruling British that Indians were incapable of ruling themselves. In the early 20th century, the Congress grew a large following not just within the intellectual and upper classes, but across all portions of Indian society. While it gained widespread support, opinions as to how to best redress their grievances varied wildly. Some wanted to work through the existing system to oppose British rule, others wanted a violent uprising, and still others had their own unique plans. Enter Mahatma Gandhi, the most influential man of the movement for independence from British rule. Gandhi was born in India, but had been a law clerk and human rights activist in South Africa before returning to India during World War I. Upon his return, he became a vocal critic of the British government and encouraged peaceful uprisings across the Indian subcontinent in the 1920s. The British responded to these uprisings with violent suppression, including a massacre of hundreds of peaceful protesters in Amritsar in 1919. For fomenting rebellion, however peaceful his demonstrations may have been, Gandhi was imprisoned in 1922. Gandhi was released from prison only 2 years later and returned to his work throwing off the shackles of British rule, though most of his work directly after his release concerned reconciling the Indian subcontinent's Muslim and Hindu communities to one another. In 1930, he led a march to the sea in protest of the new British salt tax, and in 1931 he attended the Round Table Conference in London with the hopes of securing greater freedoms for Indians. Though Gandhi's goal of a free India would not be recognized until 1947, his work and use of nonviolent protest are often considered the greatest contributions to Indian independence. The early 20th century is often seen as the beginning of the end of the colonial era. While the victorious Allied powers succeeded in breaking up the Ottoman Empire, Turkish nationalists led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk were successful at maintaining a Turkish state regardless of the Allies' intentions. Likewise, the nonviolent protests of the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi fostered the growth of Indian nationalism and an aversion to strict British rule. Both such movements wanted to create self-governing countries both by and for the people who actually lived in the region.